The Siege of Yorktown, which took place in 1781, marked a decisive victory in the American Revolution. The combined American and French forces, under the command of George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau, cornered British General Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. The town was transformed into a brutal battlefield, and after weeks of intense fighting, Cornwallis surrendered, effectively ending the war. Though centuries have passed, Yorktown remains a place steeped in history, and some say the echoes of that conflict still linger. Beneath the tranquil modern landscape lies a darker layer of history, haunted by the souls of those who perished during the siege. Visitors to Yorktown have long reported eerie encounters, phantom soldiers marching through the fog, disembodied voices calling out from the earthworks, and flickering lanterns that vanish upon approach. In this chilling exploration, we delve into the spectral tales of Yorktown, where the spirits of the American Revolution continue to roam. These are not just stories of hauntings, but of restless spirits forever tied to one of the most pivotal moments in American history. Story 1. The Phantom Drummer Boy. Yorktown, Virginia, in the heart of the American Revolution, was a place of immense importance and bloody sacrifice. Its soil was soaked with the blood of thousands who had fought valiantly for both the American and British sides. Among those who fought were not just hardened soldiers, but also young boys, some no older than 12 or 13, who played an essential role in military communication. They were the drummers, responsible for relaying orders in the chaos of battle by using different drum beats. One such boy was Thomas, the youngest son of a patriot family, who had taken up the drum when his older brothers went to war. His father had died earlier in the war, leaving Thomas, his mother, and 2 sisters behind. Despite his youth, Thomas had always yearned to join the fight for independence, and his mother, reluctantly, allowed him to become a drummer for one of the local militias. Little did she know that this decision would forever tie her son to the tragic history of Yorktown. It was a time of death and desperation, a final push to end the war. General Cornwallis and his British forces were cornered, and the combined American and French armies were preparing their siege. In the thick of the battle, Thomas drummed his commands, his small frame barely visible through the smoke and confusion. But the drumming ceased suddenly, and Thomas disappeared into the chaos, lost in the fog of war. His body was never recovered. The tale of Thomas became local lore, passed down through generations as the story of the Phantom Drummer Boy. Over the years, visitors to the Yorktown battlefield have claimed to hear the faint beat of a drum, steady, rhythmic, and ghostly, especially on foggy mornings. Some say that Thomas is still there, his spirit trapped, drumming for orders that will never come, waiting for his lost comrades. It was on one of these eerie mornings, many years after the war had ended, that Jacob Turner, a local resident, made his chilling discovery. Jacob had lived his entire life in Yorktown, working as a blacksmith and raising a family. He wasn't a superstitious man by nature, though he had heard the stories of the ghostly drummer boy since he was a child. On this particular morning, Jacob had risen early to walk along the battlefield as he often did. The morning fog had rolled in thicker than usual, wrapping the landscape in a heavy gray shroud. As he strolled past the quiet fields, lost in thought, a faint sound reached his ears. It was the unmistakable rhythm of a drum. Jacob paused, his heart giving a quick thud. He turned toward the sound, his breath visible in the cool air. At first, he thought it must be an early morning reenactment, though it was odd there were no scheduled events that day, and the sound was coming from deeper in the woods, far from where reenactors usually gathered. Curiosity overcame him. Jacob began walking in the direction of the drumming, the sound growing louder as he approached. The beat was steady, too steady to be random noise. It had a pattern, a purpose. As he moved through the mist, the landscape seemed to shift, growing darker and more ominous with each step. Then, through the thick veil of fog, Jacob saw him. A small figure, barely visible at first, standing at the edge of the woods. The boy was dressed in what appeared to be a Revolutionary War uniform, tattered, dirty, and much too large for his slight frame. His back was turned to Jacob, his shoulders rising and falling in time with the rhythm of the drum he clutched in his hands. Jacob froze, his heart pounding. The boy's drumming was relentless, as if he was signaling commands to troops that no longer existed. Jacob opened his mouth to call out, but no sound came. The boy suddenly stopped drumming. He turned slowly, his face hidden by the shadow of his hat. As he turned fully toward Jacob, the blacksmith was hit with an overwhelming wave of sadness, an emotion so raw and powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. The boy's face was pale, almost translucent, with vacant eyes that seemed to see right through Jacob. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, who had suffered more than anyone should in such a short life. Jacob's pulse quickened as the boy stared at him in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the boy lifted his drumsticks and began to march. His small feet made no sound as they moved across the grass. He passed into the thickest part of the fog, disappearing into the mist as though he had never been there at all. The drum beats faded, leaving Jacob standing alone in the silence of the morning. After that morning, Jacob could not shake the image of the boy from his mind. He told a few trusted friends about the encounter, but many dismissed his story, attributing it to the early hour or the tricks that fog could play on the senses. Yet Jacob knew what he had seen, and more importantly, what he had felt. The sadness, the loneliness, the feeling that the boy was trapped, drumming commands that no one would ever hear again. Word of Jacob's sighting spread quietly through the town, reigniting interest in the legend of the phantom drummer boy. Over the next few decades, more reports began to surface, particularly on misty mornings. Visitors to the battlefield would claim to hear the rhythmic pounding of a drum, or sometimes even catch a glimpse of a small, shadowy figure moving silently through the fog. In 1976, during the bicentennial celebrations, a group of Revolutionary War reenactors decided to camp out near the battlefield. Among them was Daniel Lawson, a seasoned reenactor with a deep respect for history. Daniel had heard the ghost stories. Of course, anyone involved in historical reenactments had, but he didn't put much stock in them. Ghosts were for campfire tales, not for serious historians like him. That night, after the festivities had ended and most of the reenactors had turned in for the night, Daniel found himself unable to sleep. He stepped outside his tent, breathing in the cool night air. A heavy fog had descended on the campsite, much like the fogs described in the stories of the phantom drummer. He began to walk, enjoying the quiet of the night, when he heard the steady rhythm of a drum, faint but unmistakable. His first thought was that one of the other reenactors was up late, perhaps practicing. But as he followed the sound, it became clear that the drumming wasn't coming from anywhere near the camp. The sound led him deeper into the mist, toward the very heart of the old battlefield. As Daniel drew closer, the drumming grew louder, more insistent. His pulse quickened, though he told himself there was nothing to fear. It was just another reenactor, surely. But then he saw him. Standing in the clearing, illuminated by an eerie glow that seemed to come from nowhere, was a young boy. The boy's uniform was ragged, his drum worn and battered. His hands moved rhythmically, beating the drum with an intensity that sent chills down Daniel's spine. Daniel called out to the boy, but the child didn't respond. The boy's vacant eyes stared straight ahead, his expression one of deep sorrow. The drumming continued, louder now, echoing through the fog like a heartbeat. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the drumming stopped. The boy slowly turned, his empty gaze locking onto Daniel's for the briefest of moments. And then he was gone, vanishing into the mist, leaving Daniel alone in the dark. Daniel stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always been a skeptic, but there was no denying what he had just witnessed. The boy had been real, or at least as real as any ghost could be. After that night, Daniel became obsessed with the story of the phantom drummer boy. He scoured historical records, hoping to find some mention of a young drummer who had gone missing during the siege of Yorktown, but there were no specific names. Drummer boys were often unrecorded in the official documents, their roles deemed too minor for history to remember. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Daniel continued to search. He interviewed locals, hoping to find someone who had seen the boy as he had, but most people dismissed his story as a hallucination brought on by the fog and exhaustion. Still, Daniel couldn't let it go. He knew what he had seen, and he knew that the boy was still out there trapped, just as he had been all those years ago. Over time, Daniel's obsession began to take a toll on him. His friends noticed the change, the way he would drift off in conversation, his mind always elsewhere. He spent more and more time at the battlefield, walking through the fog in the early morning hours, listening for the sound of the drum. And sometimes, late at night, he would hear it, the faint, steady rhythm, calling to him from the mist. Years passed, and Daniel's life became consumed by the phantom drummer boy. He had long since stopped caring about whether anyone believed him or not. The boy's presence was real to him, and that was all that mattered. One misty morning, Daniel returned to the battlefield, determined to have one last encounter. This time, he would not just observe. This time, he would confront the boy, speak to him, try to help him find peace. As he walked through the thick fog, the familiar sound of the drum began to echo in the distance. Daniel's heart raced with anticipation. He followed the sound, moving deeper into the battlefield, until he saw the boy standing once again in the clearing. The boy's face was as sorrowful as ever, his small hands moving mechanically over the drum. But this time, Daniel didn't just stand and watch. He stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know who you are," Daniel called out. "I know you've been trapped here, playing that drum for all these years. But you don't have to do it anymore. The war is over, you can rest." For a moment, the boy seemed to hesitate. His hands slowed, the drumming growing softer. He lifted his head, his vacant eyes meeting Daniel's. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered. "I'm sorry for what happened to you. But you can let go. You're free now." The boy stared at him for what felt like an eternity. And then, for the first time in all the years Daniel had seen him, the boy smiled a small, sad smile, but a smile nonetheless. The drumming stopped. The boy slowly faded into the mist, his form dissolving into the fog like a dream. And as he disappeared, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace wash over him, as though a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. The phantom drummer boy was gone. After that morning, Daniel never heard the drumming again. The boy had found peace, his spirit finally free from the battlefield where he had been trapped for so long. But the legend of the phantom drummer boy lived on. Visitors to Yorktown still spoke of hearing faint drum beats in the distance, though the sightings became less frequent over the years. Some believed the boy's spirit had moved on, while others thought he still lingered, watching over the battlefield from the mist. For Daniel, the experience had changed him forever. He no longer searched for the boy, but he carried the memory of that final encounter with him, always. It was a reminder that some battles never truly end, and that the past is never as far away as we might think. The phantom drummer boy had played his last beat, but his story, like so many others from that bloody chapter in history, would never be forgotten. Story 2, The Lantern of Cornwallis's Cave, Yorktown, Virginia, is a place where history and mystery intertwine, and few places are as steeped in legend as Cornwallis's Cave. This small, unassuming cave near the York River has long been associated with General Charles Cornwallis, who commanded British forces during the final siege of the American Revolution. According to local lore, Cornwallis used the cave as a temporary headquarters or even a hiding place during the waning days of the siege, though historical records on this are unclear. What is not in dispute, however, is the eerie atmosphere that surrounds the cave today. Over the years, visitors to the cave have reported strange occurrences, phantom lights, the sound of muffled voices, and the shadowy figure of a man holding a lantern seen at the entrance. Though the town's residents often chalk it up to overactive imaginations, these tales have persisted for generations, passed down by locals who claim that Cornwallis, or perhaps one of his officers, still haunts the cave. One such story comes from the early 1920s, when Peter Henley, a local fisherman, had his own terrifying encounter. Henley had heard the rumors about the cave since childhood, but like most, he dismissed them as mere legend until one night when he saw something that would change his life forever. Peter Henley was a pragmatic man. Born and raised in Yorktown, he had spent his entire life working on the York River, navigating its waters by day and night. He was familiar with every bend and curve of the shoreline, including Cornwallis's Cave. Though he had never ventured inside, he had always been fascinated by the stories of ghostly lights that supposedly flickered within. It was on a cold, clear night in late autumn when Peter decided to satisfy his curiosity once and for all. He had been out on the river, setting crab pots, when his gaze drifted toward the cave's entrance. There, just as the legends described, he saw a faint light flickering inside. Peter squinted, trying to make out what could be causing the light. It wasn't the reflection of his lantern, and there were no other boats nearby. His pulse quickened. The logical part of his mind told him it was probably nothing, perhaps the moonlight reflecting off the rocks. But deep down, he felt an uneasy pull, a need to see for himself whether the stories were true. With a deep breath, Peter steered his small boat toward the shore, the rhythmic splash of his oars cutting through the quiet of the night. The light grew stronger as he approached, flickering like a flame trapped in the darkness of the cave. As he tied his boat to the dock and stepped onto the pebbled shore, the air seemed to grow colder, and a chill ran down his spine. He stood at the entrance of the cave, peering inside. The light danced deeper within the shadows, moving as though it were carried by an unseen hand. Peter hesitated for a moment, his hand tightening around the handle of his lantern, but then his curiosity got the better of him. With cautious steps, he entered the cave. As Peter ventured deeper into the cave, the walls closed in around him, the narrow passage damp with moisture from the river. His lantern cast a dim light, illuminating the rocky path ahead, but it did little to dispel the growing sense of unease that gnawed at him. The flickering light in the distance moved steadily ahead, always just out of reach. Peter's heart pounded in his chest, but he pressed on, determined to discover the source. He reminded himself that ghosts weren't real. There had to be a logical explanation, a trick of the light, or perhaps another person exploring the cave. But as he went deeper, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and a strange pressure seemed to weigh down on him, making it difficult to breathe. The faint sound of water dripping echoed through the cave, but underneath it, Peter thought he heard something else, whispers, soft and indistinct, as if the cave itself was murmuring secrets long buried. The light ahead flickered again, and for a brief moment, Peter caught a glimpse of a figure. It was the shadowy outline of a man, holding a lantern in one hand. The figure wore a long coat, its silhouette unmistakably that of a British officer from the Revolutionary War era. Peter's breath caught in his throat as the figure turned slightly, its face obscured by the shadows. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Peter stood frozen, his mind racing. Could this really be Cornwallis? Was the general's spirit still haunting the cave where he had supposedly hidden during the siege? Then, without a word, the figure turned and began walking deeper into the cave. Peter felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as the figure retreated into the darkness. His rational mind screamed at him to turn back, to run, but his legs seemed rooted to the spot. Against his better judgment, he found himself following the ghostly figure. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. The cave walls were slick with moisture, and the ground beneath Peter's feet was uneven and treacherous. The faint light of his lantern barely penetrated the darkness, but the figure's lantern glowed brighter, its flame flickering in a way that seemed almost alive. Peter's thoughts raced. Could this really be the ghost of General Cornwallis, the man who had commanded the British forces in their final defeat? The stories of Cornwallis using this cave had always been regarded as more myth than fact, but now, standing here in the pitch-black cave, Peter wasn't so sure. The figure continued to lead him deeper into the cave's winding passages, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. Peter tried to speak, but his throat felt tight, and no words would come. All he could do was follow, his mind spinning with fear and fascination. Finally, the figure came to a stop in a wide chamber deep within the cave. The walls were damp, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. The figure stood at the center of the chamber, his back to Peter, the lantern held high in his hand. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Peter stood a few feet behind the figure, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. Then slowly the figure turned. Peter's blood ran cold. The man's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken, as if drained of life. His lips were cracked and bloodless, and his uniform, once crisp and clean, was tattered and torn, hanging loosely on his skeletal frame. This was no living man. This was a ghost, a remnant of the past that had somehow lingered in the cave for over a century. The figure raised the lantern higher, its light casting eerie shadows across the chamber. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "He will come." Peter's heart stopped. The voice was hoarse, rasping, as though the man had not spoken in years. But before Peter could process the words, the figure began to fade, the light of the lantern dimming as the ghostly officer slowly vanished into the darkness. Peter stood there, alone in the cave, his mind reeling. He didn't know what the ghost had meant or who he was. But one thing was certain, Peter had just encountered something far beyond the realm of the natural. He turned and fled the cave, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the darkness as he made his way back to the shore. Peter never returned to Cornwallis's cave after that night. He tried to put the experience behind him, but it haunted him for the rest of his life. He told only a few close friends about what had happened, and most of them dismissed the story as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or fear. But Peter knew what he had seen and heard. In the years that followed, other locals reported similar encounters. Visitors to the cave would often see the faint glow of a lantern deep within its recesses, only for it to vanish when they approached. Some claimed to hear the sound of boots echoing off the stone walls, or the soft murmur of voices, too faint to make out. But the most chilling encounters involved the same shadowy figure that Peter had seen the British officer, holding a lantern, his face pale and gaunt. Some believed it was Cornwallis himself, forever condemned to wander the cave where he had once sought refuge. Others thought it was the spirit of one of his officers, perhaps a loyal aide who had died during the siege. Whoever or whatever the figure was, one thing was clear: Cornwallis's cave was haunted. In the 1980s, a young historian named Margaret Aldridge became fascinated with the stories surrounding Cornwallis's cave. A native of Virginia, Margaret had grown up hearing tales of the ghostly lantern and the mysterious figure that haunted the cave, and as an academic, she was determined to separate fact from fiction. Margaret's research led her to believe that the cave had indeed been used by British forces during the siege of Yorktown, though whether Cornwallis himself had taken refuge there was still up for debate. But what intrigued her most were the countless eyewitness accounts of paranormal activity. Margaret had never been one to believe in ghosts, but the sheer number of stories spanning over a century was impossible to ignore. In the summer of 1987, Margaret decided to investigate the cave for herself. Armed with a flashlight, a tape recorder, and a camera, she made her way to Cornwallis's cave on a warm evening, determined to document any strange occurrences. The entrance to the cave was cool and inviting, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. As Margaret stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. She turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as she made her way deeper into the cave. For the first few minutes, there was nothing unusual, just the sound of her footsteps and the occasional drip of water echoing through the cave. But then, as she reached the deeper recesses of the cave, something strange happened. The beam of her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the cave was plunged into darkness. Margaret's heart raced as she fumbled with the flashlight, trying to steady it. When the light came back on, she saw it a faint glow in the distance, deep within the cave. It was the light of a lantern, flickering just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She raised her camera, snapping a photo of the distant light, but when she looked at the screen, there was nothing there. Determined to get closer, Margaret walked toward the light, her footsteps slow and deliberate. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, and she could see the outline of a figure standing in the shadows, holding the lantern aloft. Margaret's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. But just as she was about to speak, the figure turned and vanished, leaving only darkness behind. Margaret left the cave that night, shaken but excited. She had experienced something she couldn't quite explain, but it wasn't enough. She returned to the cave several more times over the following weeks, hoping to capture more evidence of the ghostly figure. On her final visit, something different happened. As Margaret entered the cave, she immediately felt a sense of unease. The air was colder than usual, and the cave was darker, the shadows seeming to press in on her from all sides. She switched on her flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely illuminating the path ahead. She pressed on, her heart pounding in her chest. The lantern light appeared once again, but this time it was much closer. Margaret could see the figure clearly now, a British officer, his face pale and gaunt, just as the others had described. The figure raised the lantern, and for the first time, Margaret heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. The figure began to move deeper into the cave, and Margaret followed, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. As they reached the innermost chamber, the figure stopped and turned to face her. His eyes, hollow and sunken, locked onto hers, and in that moment, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow, a deep, aching grief that seemed to resonate from the very walls of the cave. "He will come," the figure whispered, the words barely audible. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure vanished, the lantern light fading into the darkness. Margaret stood alone in the cave, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what the ghost had meant, or who he was. But one thing was certain: Cornwallis Cave was a place where the past and the present collided, a place where the spirits of the American Revolution still lingered, waiting for something or someone to set them free. Margaret's experiences in Cornwallis Cave were never fully explained. Though she captured several photos and recordings during her visits, none of the evidence was conclusive. The lantern light remained elusive, and the identity of the ghostly figure, whether it was Cornwallis or one of his officers, remained a mystery. But the legend of Cornwallis's cave continued to grow, passed down through generations of Yorktown residents and visitors. The faint glow of the lantern, the shadowy figure in the cave, and the whispered words "he will come" became part of the town's enduring folklore, a reminder that history is never truly gone. And for those brave enough to venture into the cave at night, the question remains: will you see the lantern's glow? Story 3. The Ghostly Soldiers on the Redoubts. The siege of Yorktown in 1781 was a decisive victory that forever changed the course of the American Revolution. It was here, on the battle-scarred fields of Yorktown, that the British forces under General Cornwallis were finally defeated by the combined American and French armies. The bloody siege culminated in the storming of the British redoubts, a series of fortifications that had served as the last line of defense for the besieged British forces. Redoubts 9 and 10 became particularly famous for the intense fighting that occurred there. These earthen fortifications were the sites of fierce hand-to-hand combat between American and French soldiers and their British adversaries. The final assault on these redoubts, led by Alexander Hamilton on the American side and the French Marquis de Lafayette, was brutal and swift. By the end of the night, the redoubts had fallen, and the fate of the British army was sealed. But the stories of Redoubts 9 and 10 do not end with the surrender of Cornwallis. Over the centuries, visitors to these earthen fortifications have reported eerie sights and sounds, ghostly figures in military uniforms, the clang of swords, and the disembodied cries of soldiers long dead. The redoubts are said to be haunted by the spirits of those who died in the final, desperate battle. In 1942, during World War II, a group of American soldiers stationed near Yorktown had an encounter with these spectral soldiers, an experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The summer of 1942 was tense. World War II had reached a fever pitch, and the United States was fully involved in the conflict. Across the country, military bases were being fortified, and soldiers were stationed in key strategic locations to defend the homeland against potential attacks. One such unit was stationed near Yorktown, tasked with patrolling the coastline and guarding critical infrastructure. Sergeant William Hayes and his small unit had been stationed in Yorktown for several months. The men were seasoned soldiers, hardened by the rigors of military life, but Yorktown was a quiet assignment. The war felt distant in the peaceful Virginia countryside, and most nights were uneventful. One warm July evening, Sergeant Hayes and his unit were conducting a routine patrol near the old battlefield. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep indigo, dotted with stars. The men moved quietly through the fields, their boots crunching softly on the grass, The familiar landscape of Yorktown stretched out before them, the distant redoubts little more than shadowy mounds in the fading light. As they approached Redoubt 10, something strange happened. The air seemed to grow colder, and a thick mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around the men's legs. The sudden change in temperature sent a shiver down Sergeant Hayes' spine, but he dismissed it as nothing more than an odd weather pattern. He signaled for the men to continue. But then, from the direction of the redoubt, they heard a faint, rhythmic sound that made the hair on the back of Sergeant Hayes' neck stand on end. It was the sound of marching feet. Sergeant Hayes halted the patrol, his eyes scanning the darkness. There shouldn't have been anyone else out there, certainly no other military units. The soldiers listened intently, their rifles raised, but the mist obscured their view of the redoubt. The sound of marching grew louder, closer. Sergeant Hayes felt a surge of unease. The footfalls were heavy, deliberate, as though a large group of men were advancing. But who were they? And why hadn't they been informed of another unit patrolling the area? "Who goes there?" Hayes called out, his voice cutting through the mist. There was no response. The marching continued, steady and unrelenting. Hayes glanced at the men around him. They were as tense as he was, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Something wasn't right. The sound was coming from the direction of Redoubt 10, but there was no sign of anyone, just the eerie fog swirling around the base of the fortification. Then, through the mist, they saw them. At first, it was difficult to make out the figures. They were little more than shadowy silhouettes, their outlines barely visible through the thick fog. But as the soldiers watched in stunned silence, the figures became clearer: men in uniform, marching in formation, their rifles slung over their shoulders. But these were not the uniforms of World War II soldiers. Sergeant Hayes felt his blood run cold as he realized what he was seeing. The men marching toward the redoubt were dressed in the faded uniforms of British soldiers from the Revolutionary War era. Their red coats stood out against the mist, their tricorn hats tilted at sharp angles. "Is this some kind of joke?" one of the men muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. But Hayes knew this was no joke. The British soldiers moved with a purpose, their boots thudding against the earth, their faces blank and emotionless. And yet, there was something off about them, something otherworldly. Their movements were too smooth, too mechanical, as though they were following a script that had been written centuries before. Hayes opened his mouth to issue an order, but the words caught in his throat. The British soldiers were not alone. From the other side of the redoubt, another group of men emerged this time, American and French soldiers, their uniforms just as faded, their expressions just as blank. They moved silently toward the redoubt, weapons drawn as though preparing for battle. The two groups of soldiers, American and British, faced each other at the base of the redoubt, the air thick with tension. Hayes and his men watched in disbelief as the ghostly armies stood frozen in place, waiting for a signal to begin their attack. And then, it happened. Without warning, the eerie silence was shattered by the sound of a musket firing. The shot echoed through the mist, and in an instant, the battlefield erupted into chaos. The American and French soldiers surged forward, their bayonets fixed, their eyes wild with the frenzy of battle. The British soldiers met them head-on, their rifles raised, their swords flashing in the dim light. The two sides clashed at the base of the redoubt, their movements swift and brutal. Sergeant Hayes and his men watched in stunned horror as the ghostly battle unfolded before their eyes. The soldiers fought with a ferocity that seemed both real and impossible, their weapons clanging, their shouts filling the air. The sound of metal on metal, the cries of the wounded, the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground, it was all there, as vivid and terrifying as if they had been transported back in time. But there was one crucial difference. None of the men fighting were alive. The spectral soldiers moved like shadows, their forms flickering in and out of view as they fought. Their faces, though faintly visible, were pale and hollow, their eyes empty of life. And yet they fought as though they were still bound by the same fear and anger that had driven them centuries ago. Hayes's heart raced as he struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The men around him were equally frozen, their rifles hanging limply in their hands. How could they fight something that wasn't even real? How could they escape from a battle that had already been fought? The mist thickened, and the fighting grew more intense. The ghostly soldiers moved with an urgency that seemed to defy logic, their bayonets slicing through the air, their musket balls whizzing past. And yet, despite the violence of the scene, there was no blood, no real sound of impact. It was as though the soldiers were caught in a loop, endlessly reliving the same battle without ever reaching a conclusion. Sergeant Hayes knew they had to get out of there. But just as he turned to give the order, one of the ghostly British soldiers stopped fighting and turned toward them. The British soldier's pale eyes locked onto Sergeant Hayes, and for a moment, everything went still. The battle continued to rage around them, but the soldier didn't seem to notice. His gaze was fixed on Hayes, his expression unreadable. Slowly, the soldier lowered his rifle, his form flickering in the mist as though he were caught between two worlds. Hayes felt his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The ghostly soldier took a step toward him, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The air around Hayes grew colder, the chill seeping into his bones. The soldier raised his hand, reaching out as if to grab Hayes. But before the ghost could make contact, the sound of a musket firing split the air, and the soldier turned back to the battle, his form dissolving into the fog. The spell was broken. Hayes snapped back to reality, his pulse racing. He spun around, shouting at his men to retreat, his voice barely audible over the sound of the ghostly battle. The men didn't need to be told twice. They turned and ran, their boots pounding against the earth as they fled the scene. The mist swirled around them, the sounds of the battle fading into the distance as they scrambled to safety. It wasn't until they were back at their camp that Hayes allowed himself to stop and catch his breath. His men were pale and shaken, their eyes wide with disbelief. None of them spoke for several minutes, too stunned by what they had just witnessed. Finally, one of the soldiers broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" Hayes shook his head, still trying to process the event. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it wasn't human." The following morning, Sergeant Hayes and his men reported the incident to their commanding officer. At first, the officer was skeptical. Ghost stories had always been part of the lore surrounding Yorktown, but no one had ever taken them seriously. But as the men recounted the events of the previous night, their fear was palpable, and the officer could see that something had deeply unsettled them. The area around Redoubt 10 was searched, but no evidence of the ghostly soldiers was found. The mist had lifted, and the battlefield was as quiet and peaceful as ever. The men were ordered to continue their patrols, but none of them were eager to return to the redoubts after dark. In the years that followed, other soldiers stationed in Yorktown reported strange occurrences near the redoubts, faint voices, the sound of marching feet, and the occasional glimpse of ghostly figures moving through the mist. But none of the encounters were as intense as what Sergeant Hayes and his men had witnessed. The legend of the ghostly soldiers of Redoubts 9 and 10 grew, passed down through generations of soldiers and visitors to Yorktown. Some believed that the spirits of the men who had died in the final assault on the redoubts were still there, reliving the battle in an endless loop. Others thought it was the land itself that was haunted, the memory of the siege so powerful that it had imprinted itself on the very earth. For Sergeant Hayes, the experience left a lasting mark. He never forgot the cold, hollow gaze of the British soldier who had turned toward him, nor the strange feeling of being watched by something beyond the grave. Though he returned to duty and continued to serve in the military, Hayes never spoke of the incident again. But he knew that what he had seen that night was real, just as real as the bloodshed and violence that had taken place on that very spot centuries ago. In the 1980s, Tom Garrison, a park ranger at the Yorktown battlefield, began to hear stories from visitors who claimed to have seen ghostly figures near Redoubts 9 and 10. Garrison had always been fascinated by the history of the siege, but he had never put much stock in the ghost stories. He figured they were just tall tales designed to attract tourists. That all changed one autumn evening when Garrison experienced the phenomenon for himself. It had been a quiet day at the park, and Garrison was finishing up his rounds when he decided to take a walk near Redoubt 9. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep shade of purple, casting long shadows over the battlefield. As he walked along the path, he noticed a strange mist rising from the ground, just like the mist Sergeant Hayes had described all those years ago. Garrison paused, his curiosity piqued. He had heard about the mist from other rangers, but he had never seen it for himself. He continued walking, his eyes scanning the horizon, when something caught his attention. Two figures stood at the top of Redoubt 9. At first, Garrison thought they were reenactors, two men dressed in Revolutionary War uniforms, one American and one British. But as he watched, he realized there was something odd about the way they moved. Their motions were too smooth, too precise, as though they were acting out a scene that had been played hundreds of times before. Garrison's heart raced as he watched the two figures engage in hand-to-hand combat, their swords clashing in the dim light. He could hear the faint sound of metal on metal, the grunts of exertion as the two men fought. But there was something eerie about the scene. It was silent, almost dreamlike, as though the men were moving in slow motion. He stood frozen, unable to look away. The fight continued for several minutes, the two figures locked in a deadly struggle. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the battle ended. The British soldier fell to the ground, his form dissolving into the mist. The American soldier stood for a moment, his chest rising and falling as though he were catching his breath. Then he, too, faded into the fog, leaving the redoubt empty once more. Garrison stood there in stunned silence, his mind reeling. He had just witnessed something impossible, something that defied all logic. The ghostly soldiers had returned, reliving their final battle on the very ground where they had fought and died centuries ago. In the years that followed, the stories of the ghostly soldiers of Yorktown continued to circulate. Visitors to the battlefield often reported hearing strange sounds, footsteps, voices, and the distant clash of swords, especially on foggy nights. Some even claimed to see the ghostly figures of soldiers moving through the mist, their uniforms tattered and worn, their faces pale and hollow. The redoubts, once the site of some of the most intense fighting of the Revolutionary War, had become a place where the past and present overlapped, where the spirits of those who had died for their cause still walked the earth. The siege of Yorktown may have ended in 1781, but for the ghostly soldiers of Redoubts 9 and 10, the battle was far from over. Story 4. The Woman in White. In the quiet town of Yorktown, Virginia, where the final battles of the American Revolution once raged, tales of ghostly apparitions are as old as the battle itself. While most ghost stories from the area feature the spirits of soldiers forever reliving their last moments on the battlefield, there is one story that stands apart. It is the tragic tale of the Woman in White. Locals say that during the siege of Yorktown, a young woman fell deeply in love with a soldier fighting for the American cause. Her lover, like many others, died during the brutal fighting. When word of his death reached her, she wandered the battlefield, calling out his name and searching desperately for his body. Her grief was unbearable, and she was often seen in the following days, pacing through the smoke and debris of the battlefield in her flowing white gown, refusing to believe he was truly gone. But her lover was never found. Some say his body was lost in the chaos of battle, while others believe it was buried in a mass grave. Overcome with sorrow, the woman fell ill and died not long after the war ended. Her spirit, they say, never left Yorktown. For centuries, she has been spotted wandering the battlefield and the town, dressed in the same white gown, still searching for her lost love. Her ghost has become one of the most enduring legends in Yorktown. Visitors and locals alike have reported seeing her, always in the same tragic pose, walking slowly, her head bowed, her face hidden beneath a veil of grief. Some say she appears near the Yorktown Victory Monument, while others have seen her near the battlefield, particularly on foggy nights when the past seems closer than ever. But no one has ever been able to speak to her. She always disappears before anyone can approach, fading into the mist like a distant memory. The first recorded sighting of the Woman in White occurred in 1887. It was late autumn, and the town was preparing for the colder months ahead. A young couple, Margaret and Henry Peterson, had been walking along the Yorktown battlefield at dusk, enjoying the crisp evening air. The sun had already set, casting long shadows across the field, and the mist was beginning to roll in from the river. Margaret and Henry were newlyweds, visiting Yorktown on their honeymoon. They had spent the day exploring the historical sites, marveling at the old redoubts and earthworks that had witnessed so much violence and bloodshed. But as night fell, the battlefield took on a different, more somber tone. The air felt heavier, and the quiet seemed to stretch out unnaturally. It was as they walked near the edge of the woods that Margaret saw her. Story 4: The Woman in White. In the quiet town of Yorktown, Virginia, where the final battles of the American Revolution once raged, tales of ghostly apparitions are as old as the battle itself. While most ghost stories from the area feature the spirits of soldiers forever reliving their last moments on the battlefield, there is one story that stands apart. It is the tragic tale of the Woman in White. Locals say that during the siege of Yorktown, a young woman fell deeply in love with a soldier fighting for the American cause. Her lover, like many others, died during the brutal fighting. When word of his death reached her, she wandered the battlefield, calling out his name and searching desperately for his body. Her grief was unbearable, and she was often seen in the following days, pacing through the smoke and debris of the battlefield in her flowing white gown, refusing to believe he was truly gone. But her lover was never found. Some say his body was lost in the chaos of battle, while others believe it was buried in a mass grave. Overcome with sorrow, the woman fell ill and died not long after the war ended. Her spirit, they say, never left Yorktown. For centuries, she has been spotted wandering the battlefield and the town, dressed in the same white gown, still searching for her lost love. Her ghost has become one of the most enduring legends in Yorktown. Visitors and locals alike have reported seeing her, always in the same tragic pose, walking slowly, her head bowed, her face hidden beneath a veil of grief. Some say she appears near the Yorktown Victory Monument, while others have seen her near the battlefield, particularly on foggy nights when the past seems closer than ever. But no one has ever been able to speak to her. She always disappears before anyone can approach, fading into the mist like a distant memory. The first recorded sighting of the Woman in White occurred in 1887. It was late autumn, and the town was preparing for the colder months ahead. A young couple, Margaret and Henry Peterson, had been walking along the Yorktown battlefield at dusk, enjoying the crisp evening air. The sun had already set, casting long shadows across the field, and the mist was beginning to roll in from the river. Margaret and Henry were newlyweds, visiting Yorktown on their honeymoon. They had spent the day exploring the historical sites, marveling at the old redoubts and earthworks that had witnessed so much violence and bloodshed. But as night fell, the battlefield took on a different, more somber tone. The air felt heavier, and the quiet seemed to stretch out unnaturally. It was as they walked near the edge of the woods that Margaret saw her. A woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, stood just ahead of them, her back turned. Her gown was old-fashioned, the kind of dress that would have been worn in the late 18th century, and it seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Her long hair was loose, falling over her shoulders, and she held her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. Margaret stopped in her tracks, instinctively reaching for Henry's arm. "Do you see her?" she whispered. Henry followed her gaze and nodded, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who is she? There's no one else out here." The couple called out to the woman, but she didn't respond. Instead, she began to walk, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were floating just above the ground. She headed toward the woods, her gown brushing the tops of the grass as she moved. Margaret and Henry followed, their curiosity outweighing their unease. But as they drew closer, the woman stopped and turned her head slightly, as though she had heard something in the distance. Then, without warning, she vanished, disappearing into the mist as though she had never been there at all. The couple stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what they had just witnessed. There had been no sound, no sign of her footsteps. The woman had simply dissolved into the fog, leaving behind only the memory of her pale, sorrowful figure. Margaret and Henry later recounted the experience to the innkeeper where they were staying, but the innkeeper simply nodded, unfazed. "You've seen her," he said. "The Woman in White. She's been wandering this battlefield for as long as I can remember." Nearly 50 years later, in the 1930s, another sighting of the woman in white would make headlines in Yorktown. This time, the encounter took place near the Yorktown Victory Monument, the grand column that stands as a symbol of the American triumph over the British during the Revolution. The witness was a local school teacher named Emily Stevens, a no-nonsense woman who had lived in Yorktown her entire life. She had never believed in ghosts or spirits, dismissing such tales as fanciful nonsense designed to entertain tourists. But that all changed one evening when she encountered the woman in white herself. Emily had stayed late at the school to grade papers, and by the time she left, the sun had already set. The streets were quiet as she walked toward the Yorktown Victory Monument, taking a shortcut through the park to get home. The monument loomed ahead of her, its marble column glowing faintly in the moonlight. As she approached, Emily noticed a figure standing at the base of the monument. At first, she thought it was another late-night visitor, perhaps a local resident admiring the monument. But as she drew closer, she realized something was off. The figure was a woman, dressed in a long white gown that looked like it belonged to another century. Her back was to Emily, but her posture was tense, as if she were waiting for something. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her head was bowed as though she were praying. Emily's footsteps slowed. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice hesitant. The woman didn't move. Emily felt a strange chill run down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but there was something deeply unsettling about the woman's presence. She took another step forward, but before she could speak again, the woman slowly turned her head. For a brief moment, Emily caught a glimpse of her face, pale, ethereal, and filled with such sorrow that it took Emily's breath away. But then, just like the stories said, the woman vanished, dissolving into the night air as though she had never existed. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never believed in ghosts, but there was no other explanation for what she had just seen. The woman in white was real, and she was still wandering the town, searching for something or someone she had lost long ago. In the years that followed, the legend of the woman in white became a popular tale told during the ghost tours that took place in Yorktown every autumn. By the 1970s, tourists flocked to the town, eager to explore its haunted history and hear stories of the soldiers and spirits that were said to still roam the streets and battlefields. One such ghost tour took place on a particularly foggy night in October 1975. The group, consisting of about 20 tourists, gathered at the Yorktown battlefield, their breath visible in the cool night air. The guide, an older man named Richard Hartley, was a local historian with a deep knowledge of the town's history and its many ghostly legends. As they walked through the battlefield, Richard told the group about the various hauntings that had been reported over the years, the ghostly soldiers on the redoubts, the mysterious lantern at Cornwallis Cave, and of course, the woman in white. "There are many stories about her," Richard said, his voice low and somber. "Some say she lost her husband or lover during the siege, and that she's been searching for him ever since. Others believe she's a symbol of the grief and loss that so many felt during the war. But no matter who she was, her spirit has never left Yorktown." The group listened intently, their eyes scanning the darkened landscape as if expecting the woman in white to appear at any moment. The fog had grown thicker as they walked, swirling around their feet and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As they reached a small hill overlooking the battlefield, one of the tourists, a woman named Claire, gasped and pointed toward the edge of the woods. "Look!" The group turned to see what she was pointing at, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure dressed in white. Her gown was long and flowing, billowing slightly in the breeze, and her face was obscured by the mist. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, just as the stories described. Richard's heart raced. He had been leading ghost tours for years, but he had never actually seen the woman in white himself. He took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "It's her." The group watched in stunned silence as the woman in white began to move. Her steps were slow and deliberate, and it seemed as though she was gliding just above the ground. She walked toward the battlefield, her gaze fixed on some distant point that no one else could see. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. The woman in white was real, and she was here, walking the same path she had walked for centuries. But before anyone could get closer, the woman stopped, turned her head slightly, and vanished into the fog, leaving the group standing in awestruck silence. After the ghost tour, Richard Hartley became obsessed with learning more about the woman in white. He had always been fascinated by the legend, but seeing her with his own eyes had shaken him to his core. He couldn't stop thinking about her, who she had been, why she was still here, and what she was searching for. Richard began to dig through old records, hoping to find some clue as to the identity of the woman. He pored over letters, diaries, and military records from the time of the siege, looking for any mention of a young woman who had lost her lover in the battle. But the records were incomplete, and many of the names of those who had died were lost to history. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Richard was convinced that the woman in white had once been real. He believed her story was one of tragedy and heartbreak, a reflection of the countless lives that had been torn apart by the war. He interviewed locals, hoping to find someone who had more information about the ghostly woman. But most of what he heard were variations of the same story. The woman had lost her lover in the battle, and her spirit had never moved on. Some said she was waiting for him to return, while others believed she was trapped in an endless loop, forever searching for a man who had been lost to time. But no one knew for certain. As the years went on, Richard continued to lead ghost tours in Yorktown, always hoping for another glimpse of the woman in white. But as the sightings grew less frequent, he began to worry that her spirit had finally moved on. Then, in the summer of 1989, something happened that would forever change his understanding of the legend. It was late in the evening, and Richard was leading a small group of tourists through the battlefield. The night was warm, and the air was thick with humidity, but there was no fog this time. The tour was nearing its end, and Richard had just finished telling the story of the woman in white. As they walked back toward the parking lot, one of the tourists, a young man named James, pointed toward the woods. "Is that her?" Richard turned, his heart skipping a beat. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was the woman in white. She was just as he remembered her gown, long and flowing, her face hidden beneath a veil of mist. But this time, something was different. She was holding something in her hands. Richard squinted, trying to make out what it was. As he drew closer, he realized it was a small locket, the kind worn by women during the 18th century. The locket dangled from a delicate chain, and the woman held it tightly, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. For the first time, Richard felt a deep sense of understanding. The locket had belonged to her lover, he was sure of it. She had been searching for it all these years, believing that finding it would somehow reunite her with the man she had lost. Richard took a step forward, his voice soft. "You can rest now," he whispered. "You've found him." The woman in white lifted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Richard's. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a spark of understanding. And then, just as she always had, she faded into the night, leaving behind only the memory of her sorrowful figure. After that night, the sightings of the woman in white became even rarer. Some believed that Richard's encounter had finally brought her peace, that her spirit had moved on to be with the lover she had searched for all these years. But others weren't so sure. The battlefield was still a place of deep emotion, a place where the past and present overlapped in ways that defied explanation. And though the woman in white had seemingly disappeared, there were those who believed that she would one day return, still searching, still waiting. For Richard, the experience left a lasting impact. He continued to lead ghost tours, but he never again saw the woman in white. He wrote about his encounters with her, preserving her story for future generations, and ensuring that the memory of the tragic figure who had wandered Yorktown's battlefield for so long would never be forgotten. The woman in white may be gone, but her legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of those who have seen her, felt her sorrow, and understood the depth of her loss. And on quiet nights, when the mist rolls in from the river and the air grows still, Some say you can still catch a glimpse of her walking through the trees, her white gown billowing in the wind, forever searching for the man she loved. Yorktown, Virginia, is a place where history and the supernatural intertwine. The spirits of the American Revolution continue to walk its streets, haunt its redoubts, and linger in the shadows of its historic buildings. Whether it's the tragic ghost of the drummer boy, the lantern of Cornwallis's cave, or the spectral soldiers still patrolling the battlefield, these hauntings serve as a poignant reminder of the human cost of war. The ghosts of Yorktown remain, tied to the land and to the events that shaped a nation. Perhaps they are waiting for something, for recognition, for peace, or for their stories to be told once more. If you ever visit Yorktown, take a moment to listen closely to the whispers of the past. The spirits of the American Revolution may still be watching, waiting to share their tales of courage, loss, and the quest for freedom. Have you experienced anything strange at a historical site? Share your stories of the paranormal, and let the spirits of Yorktown know they are not forgotten.